Let's head back into Maya and take a look at how we actually create attributes. So here I have an object in my scene. Let's select it. Then in channel box, we'll find edit at the top. And in here, we'll find add attribute. Let's open that. This brings up the interface we were just talking about. Okay, we're already very familiar with all these properties. We can start creating one here. So for the long name we just talked about, this is the attribute's actual name in the Maya system. So here, for example, let's write what we just tested. This is an attribute. We'll use keyable here, and the default is float. We won't change this for now. And let's add it. Okay, so now we see a newly added attribute in the channel box. And this attribute, notice its format. Between each word there's a space separating them. We've talked about this before. This is to make it easier for us to read. If you want to display the long name format in our channel box, you can do that too. We can go to Edit and at the very bottom, Channel Names. We see the default is nice. We just talk about what nice name is. If we switch it to long, that's the long name we were talking about. Now we can see all the attributes are in Maya's long name format. But just for readability, let's switch it back. Okay, next let's add another attribute. Let's see how we can override this long name, display a completely different name. We'll still use this attribute. Since we've already added this attribute, we can't use the same name again. So I'll add a number at the end. Okay, and when we check override nice name, its input field becomes editable. We can write something different here. It actually supports a lot more characters. For example, test atter. I can even add some hyphens after it. Then we add it. Now look, what's displayed here is test atter with a bunch of hyphens. But the actual name, if we switch back again, its name is this is an attribute too. That weird name we just said is just to make it easier for us to read. Next, let's look at keyable, displayable, and hidden. Here let's first make an attribute that can be keyframed, which is what we call keyable. We'll call it keyable atter, and we'll add it. This one is no different from the attributes we've seen before, because we didn't change anything below. Next, let's create a displayable attribute. Displayable. As we've said, the only difference between it and keyable is that it doesn't support keyframes, but it can be displayed in our channel box. So here we select displayable. Now let's look at the difference between them. The displayable one has a gray color in front of it. This light gray color means that it cannot be keyframed. Finally, let's create a hidden attribute. We'll call it hidden atter. After we add this attribute, we'll notice it doesn't show up in our channel box at all. Because as we said, it's hidden and won't be displayed in our channel box. Okay, now let's see the difference. Let's select our object and we'll close this window for now. Now let's press S on the keyboard. At this point, we'll see all of our previous attributes now have a red color in front of them. What does red mean? Red means this attribute has been keyframed. But look at this attribute at the bottom, the one we set to displayable. It doesn't accept keyframes, but it's displayed in our channel box. This attribute, as we see, is still light gray. That means it still hasn't received any keyframes. Okay, so we can delete these keyframes. There are many different ways. We can right-click on our timeline and select delete. Or we can select these attributes. Just hold the left mouse button and drag over them. Then right-click and choose break connection. Both ways work. So this is what we mean by the difference between keyable and displayable attributes. We also created a hidden attribute earlier. How can we find this attribute in Maya? We can press Ctrl+A to go to the attribute editor. Because all the attributes we just made were added to the transform node. So we'll find our transform node. At the very bottom of these tabs, we'll find a tab here called Extra Attributes. Let's click that. Here we'll see all the attributes we just added. And in here we'll find an attribute called Hidden Atter. This is the one we just created. So if an attribute is hidden, we can find it from this location. Okay, let's open the Add Attribute window again. Next, let's look at these different attribute types. Let's start with vector. Here, let's add a vector type attribute. We'll call it vector atter. Now watch. When I click Add, it it will automatically add 3 attributes for us. Vector adder x, y, and z. Just as we said, it has 3 axes corresponding to x, y, and z. We can edit them individually. Next is integer. Let's add 1. This way we see that 2, 3, 5 are all supported, or -10 is also supported. But if I write 1.2, we see it's not supported. Here I'll write 2.2, it still goes back to the value of 0, because it doesn't support us entering a float. Then let's create a string adder. A string attribute won't be displayed in our channel box. We can only see this from our attribute editor. So let's look at our attribute editor. There's a string adder here. Now we can type any characters we want in here, and it will be stored in this attribute. Let's continue. Float. We're all very familiar with this one. I'll create one. But it's no different from the ones we've set up before. Then Boolean. Boolean is what we talked about before, like visibility attribute. It's just on and off. The corresponding numbers are 1 or 0. Let's add it. By default, it's off, which is 0. If we set it to 1, we see it's on. Set it to 0 and it's off. Finally, let's look at enum. Here we'll see this bottom menu becomes editable. By default, it has 2 options, green and blue. We can edit this ourselves. For example, I'll select green, and I can change it to, say, apple. And the second one, blue, we can change that to orange. And if I want to add more, what do? Just click below our current options. Here we can type in a new name. So for example, I'll type banana. This way, when we click add, we'll see in my channel box, I have a new enum type attribute. When I click it, there's a drop-down menu, and I can select from it. But remember what I said before, internally, Maya doesn't actually read these names. We can change these names at any time. What Maya recognizes is the index number for each option. Here, the first option's index is 0, the second option is 1. The third option is 2. If you want to see this, we can open our script editor. It's in the bottom right corner. And here, just to make it easier to see, I'll clear all the history up here. Now take a look. When I change my selection, for now, we don't need to worry about the actual syntax of these commands. We just need to see the general idea. What does setAttr mean? SetAttr means to assign a value to this attribute. Which attribute? The attribute we just created. First is our node name, which is mesh. Then a dot, which represents the attribute. Then the actual attribute name. We can see here, it's using the long name, not the nice name that's displayed. And what's the value being input? It shows 1 here. Why is it 1? Because it's our second option. The second option's index is 1. The first option, Maya starts indexing from 0. Let's check. When I switch to apple, it shows 0. And if I switch to banana, it shows 2. Okay, next, let's look at its value range. I'll select the model again. Let's go back to the float type. We need to note, you see that for different types, some types support a value range, and some types don't. We can see here that only integer and float support it. So let's create another float attribute. And here let's say the range is -10 to 20. And let's make the default 5. Then we add it. This way, when we add the attribute without editing anything, its default value is 5. Then when we modify this value, there are many ways to modify the value. We can type directly in here. For example, type 20 as we mentioned. We can modify it directly. Or we can also do sliding adjustment on the attribute. How do we do that? Select the attribute. Then in our viewport, hold down the middle mouse button and drag left and right. Look, after I hold the middle mouse button, my cursor's icon has also changed. This way we can see I can drag it between the left and right range. Look, when I get to -10, I can't go any lower. When I get to 20, I can't change it to a higher value either. This is because we have a limit set. Also, if our range is very small and we want to adjust it more precisely, we can also hold down Ctrl and then middle mouse drag like this. Now look, when I drag it, it's changing the value in increments of tenths of a decimal. But if I don't hold the control key, you see, it's basically changing by 12, 13, 14, 15 at that kind of increment. So that's the difference between them. So that was our explanation of how to add Maya attributes.